For the first time in decades, a small African nation stood on the global stage not to plead, not to apologize, but to say one simple word: enough. It was not delivered with diplomatic restraint. There were no hushed tones or carefully worded footnotes. It was thunder. On August 18, 2025, the government of Burkina Faso expelled the top United Nations representative from its soil. 3 words were etched into the official communiqué: persona non grata. And with them, the curtain lifted on one of the most seismic standoffs between Africa and the international order in recent memory. What sparked this? A report. But not just any report. A United Nations document that, in the eyes of Burkinabé leaders, crossed a line no sovereign nation should ever tolerate. It placed their national army, the very force shielding villagers from extremist horror, alongside the same terrorists they were dying to fight. Was this the reckless lashing out of an insecure regime? Or the long-awaited roar of a continent reclaiming its dignity? Stay with us, this is not just a diplomatic scuffle, it's a roar for African sovereignty that may shake the global order. Subscribe, not for the headlines, but for the truth behind them, truth our ancestors were never allowed to speak. Burkina Faso is not a nation often in the headlines. Landlocked, resource-scarce, and long overlooked by global powers, it is a country that has borne the weight of conflict without the reward of international spotlight. But on August 18, 2025, the country forced the world to look and listen. The spark? A single document. The United Nations Annual Children and Armed Conflict Report, published in mid-August, sought to chronicle the suffering of children caught in war zones. In its analysis of Burkina Faso, however, the report placed the Burkinabé armed forces in the same category as extremist groups such as Al-Qaeda and the Islamic State in the Greater Sahara groups, long responsible for mass abductions, school bombings, and village massacres. The accusation was couched in diplomatic language, referencing alleged violations in counterinsurgency operations that may have affected children. But for the leadership in Ouagadougou, no amount of careful phrasing could dilute the insult. This wasn't just a misunderstanding, this was a moral affront. For Captain Ibrahim Traoré, the 36-year-old military leader who seized power in a coup in 2022, the report was the final straw. In his eyes and in the hearts of many of his citizens, the very institution meant to protect human dignity had just stripped their nation of its own. Burkina Faso responded with one of the most severe diplomatic tools available: persona non grata, Latin for an unwelcome person. That designation was leveled against Carol Flores Morexniak, the UN's resident coordinator in the country. She was given just days to leave. This move was more than symbolic. In modern diplomacy, the declaration of persona non grata is rarely used, and almost never against officials from multilateral organizations like the UN. It is typically reserved for spies, rogue ambassadors, or foreign officials who commit acts of sabotage. For a fragile state still dependent on humanitarian assistance to expel its top UN representative was virtually unheard of. And yet, to the Burkinabé government, it was inevitable. This was not a country posturing for headlines. This was a nation pushed to the brink by years of violence. Burkina Faso has become one of the bloodiest frontlines in the global fight against extremism. Its soldiers, many of them barely in their 20s, stand daily against well-armed jihadist factions, often with little more than rifles patched with tape. In this context, the idea that these young fighters, sacrificing their lives to protect schoolchildren and elders, could be listed alongside child-recruiting terrorists felt like the worst kind of betrayal. In a televised address, Captain Traoré's voice was calm but unwavering. To compare our soldiers, who fall on the front lines, with those who slaughter innocents is an obscenity, he said. It is an insult not just to the army but to the Burkinabé people. And in those words, the nation found its rallying cry. On state-run television, commentators questioned how a global institution like the UN could blur the line between defense and terror. In the streets of Ouagadougou, university students and war widows alike marched in protest, some holding signs that read, "Who will defend us if the UN turns against our army?" For many Burkinabé, the issue was not legal, it was deeply human. The report wasn't just a piece of paper. It was a wound that reopened every time a soldier's coffin returned to a grieving family, while foreign diplomats drafted reports in air-conditioned offices thousands of miles away. And so, the government acted not out of political expediency, but out of emotional urgency. They were not only defending their soldiers, they were defending the very idea that Africa has the right to define its own truth. But what pushed the government to take such a drastic step? The answer lies not in politics, but in something far more sacred blood. What followed the announcement on August 18th was a crescendo not of bullets, but of voices. In the dusty streets of Ouagadougou, across university halls, tea houses, army barracks, and displaced persons camps, the people of Burkina Faso spoke with a rare unity. They were no longer just responding to a report, they were reclaiming something deeper, their narrative. Captain Traoré, in his speech to the nation, did not resort to theatrical outbursts or populist slogans. His tone was measured, his words exacting. "We are not expelling a person," he said. "We are expelling an attitude, the one that dares to equate our martyrs with murderers, our defenders with destroyers." These were not empty words. They tapped into a well of buried emotion. For years, Burkina Faso's war against extremism had played out in silence, unheralded by Western media, largely invisible to international decision-makers. And now, the one institution that had long claimed moral authority, the United Nations, was perceived as turning its back. Within hours of the announcement, crowds began to gather at Independence Square in Ouagadougou. Protesters, young and old, waved the red-green-gold flag of Burkina Faso, alongside hand-painted signs reading, "Our sovereignty is not for sale," and "Hands off our army." There were no bricks thrown, no tires burned. The protest was loud but disciplined, fierce but focused. Soldiers in fatigue stood beside civilians, both declaring the same thing: the dignity of our defenders is not negotiable. State media seized the moment. Talk shows dissected the report line by line. Commentators denounced it as a colonial insult, wrapped in technical language. Religious leaders, Christian and Muslim alike, offered prayers not just for peace but for honor. In neighborhood cafes, elders recounted stories of their sons, cousins, and students who had left for the front lines and never returned. These weren't abstract figures. These were faces, voices, lives. And to see them lumped into a UN report beside the same groups that had kidnapped girls, burned churches, and massacred worshippers, it tore something loose in the national soul. But even as emotions surged in Burkina Faso, the global response was swift and polarized. In Geneva and New York, diplomats expressed shock. "Unprecedented," said one UN official off record. "Dangerous," muttered another. The move, they argued, risked undermining not only humanitarian access but the very fabric of multilateral engagement. After all, if a nation can expel a UN official over a report, what is to stop others? But in Ouagadougou, the question was turned on its head. If a report can undermine our defenders, what is left to protect? In press briefings, the Burkinabé government insisted it was not against partnership, it was against moral distortion. They reiterated their willingness to cooperate with the international community, but not at the cost of being judged by those who had never stood under the Sahel sun or buried a fallen comrade. The Ministry of Defense accused the UN of offering ammunition to jihadist propaganda. Extremist groups, they warned, would now claim legitimacy, citing the report as evidence that even the UN sees the state as the aggressor. And perhaps most chillingly, officials warned of the psychological toll on soldiers. One spokesman said, "When the men who protect our villages read that the world sees them as war criminals, it doesn't just demoralize them, it endangers us all." This was the emotional peak, the moment when rhetoric turned into raw truth. Whether or not one agrees with the government's decision, it became clear that the line had been drawn not for show, but for survival. In the Burkinabé psyche, this was not a scandal. This was sacred. But outside Burkina Faso, reactions were swift, and not all of them sympathetic. While Ouagadougou streets rang with chants of sovereignty, behind the scenes, sobering calculations began. The decision to expel the UN's top envoy may have galvanized national pride, but it also risked undermining the fragile systems that hold Burkina Faso's society together. Almost overnight, UN agencies began re-evaluating their operations in the country. These agencies, many of which operate under the resident coordinator's leadership, oversee essential programs, food distribution in conflict zones, health services in displaced persons camps, education for children in areas where teachers have fled. Without coordination, aid pipelines fray. And in a country where nearly 2 million people are internally displaced, the margin between resilience and collapse is razor thin. The most immediate concern? Humanitarian access. Many international aid workers operate under UN protection and logistics. Without clear diplomatic cover, some organizations expressed hesitation. Would their safety be guaranteed? Would funding continue if hostilities with the UN escalated? These concerns weren't abstract. In the northern provinces of Soum and Lorum, food convoys were already reporting delays. Medical supply chains faltered. Reports emerged of schools that had reopened under UN-backed programs now suspending classes again, waiting for clarity, for assurance, for leadership. Yet within the Burkinabé government, these warnings were not met with panic. They were met with a steely resolve. Officials doubled down on their message: aid must come without judgment. A government spokesperson stated, "We welcome help, but not help that comes with humiliation. We are partners, not pupils." It was a bold stance. Critics abroad saw it as reckless brinkmanship, gambling with people's lives to make a point. But inside Burkina Faso, many citizens viewed the risk differently. For them, the greatest danger wasn't temporary shortages, it was the long-term erosion of dignity. At a town hall in Kodougou, an elderly veteran stood and addressed a crowd. "If we give away our honor for a bag of rice today, what will be left for our children tomorrow?" And that sentiment is what continues to fuel Traoré's government. The belief that African sovereignty is not just a slogan, it is the air a nation breathes, even if the cost is high. Of course, the challenges are real. Some ministers have begun exploring partnerships beyond the traditional Western-dominated aid networks. Talks have been initiated with humanitarian groups in Russia, China, and Turkey, nations that, unlike many in the West, have not condemned the expulsion. Quiet diplomatic outreach suggests Burkina Faso is seeking to rebuild its safety net just with new threads. At the same time, the government has proposed the creation of a sovereign humanitarian framework, an internal mechanism to regulate aid flow in coordination with friendly states and local NGOs, ensuring assistance continues without compromising on narrative control. Still, for all the defiance, the tension is palpable. Burkina Faso walks a tightrope, fighting extremists on the battlefield while waging a diplomatic war to defend its image. The consequences of alienating the UN are far-reaching, but so too are the risks of surrendering to narratives that strip a nation of agency. If you believe this is what Africa needed all along, say amen in the comments below. And while the streets of Ouagadougou chanted for sovereignty, the halls of the United Nations fell uncomfortably silent. As the dust settled over Ouagadougou, global capitals weighed in, some with indignation, others with intrigue. In New York, the United Nations fell into an unusual silence. Secretary General Antonio Guterres offered no public rebuke, no emergency press briefing, no condemnation. Instead, diplomatic whispers echoed through the corridors of Turtle Bay. For an institution built on consensus and moral authority, the expulsion of one of its top envoys was not just a snub, it was a wound. But how to respond? That became the dilemma. Too strong a reaction could alienate not just Burkina Faso, but its regional allies Mali and Niger, who have already distanced themselves from Western military and diplomatic influence. Too soft, and the UN risked appearing powerless, a relic, unable to assert its place even among the smallest of member states. Thus, the silence became strategic, but in Africa, it was read as confirmation. Even the UN knows it went too far, one commentator in Ouagadougou declared. Western capitals, however, were not so restrained. In Washington, think tanks quickly labeled the expulsion a threat to multilateralism, a sign that Burkina Faso was drifting further into isolation. U.S. officials cautioned that humanitarian operations were now at risk and warned of the potential vacuum that could be filled by rival powers. In Paris, the reaction was sharper. French media decried Captain Traoré as reckless, another strongman leading his people toward ruin. For France, whose influence in the Sahel has diminished after military withdrawals from Mali, Niger, and now Burkina Faso, this felt like another nail in a colonial coffin. Brussels struck a more cautious note. EU officials called the move concerning, warning it could undermine vital cooperation. Yet in private, many admitted that Europe's leverage in the Sahel was dwindling. Meanwhile, in Moscow, the story was told very differently. Russian state media portrayed Burkina Faso as heroic, a brave African lion standing up to Western hypocrisy. The Kremlin offered praise, and quietly, diplomatic channels opened. Military assistance, humanitarian packages, and infrastructure proposals began to surface. Beijing, as always, played the long game. China offered no official comment. Instead, it sent envoys. Quiet diplomacy, promises of partnership without politics, aid without critique, roads, clinics, teachers. Turkey moved fast to promote its image as the humanitarian bridge. Unlike Russia's militarism or China's infrastructure-first approach, Ankara highlighted its schools, hospitals, and cultural ties. A Muslim-majority country with no colonial past, offering solidarity instead of scrutiny. And just like that, a new alignment began to take shape. The UN controversy was no longer about a report. It was about narrative control, legitimacy, dignity. Who gets to define the difference between soldier and terrorist, between sovereignty and submission? But was this really a step toward isolation, or the beginning of a new chapter in African sovereignty? Now, Burkina Faso stands at a defining crossroads. To one side lies continued resistance, the unshakable shield of sovereignty, brandished proudly by Captain Traoré and echoed by millions of Burkinabé. To the other lies the harsh truth of potential isolation, where global institutions that provide aid, recognition, and partnership may begin to turn away. Was the decision to expel the UN's representative a gamble? Perhaps, but to many in the Sahel, it was not a bet, it was a boundary. A red line drawn in dust and blood. The government has made clear its position. Partnerships are welcome, but not if they come with lectures or labels. Traoré's administration is betting on a future where aid can be reimagined not as charity, but as cooperation rooted in mutual respect. To that end, Burkina Faso has begun exploring what officials call a South-South strategy, deepening ties with nations across Africa, Latin America, and Asia that have similarly questioned the dominance of Western-led institutions. The African Union has remained cautious, but several regional blocs have quietly voiced support. At home, the sense of purpose is palpable. National broadcasters highlight local initiatives, community food programs, volunteer educators, domestic manufacturing drives. The message is clear. If the world turns its back, Burkina Faso will learn to stand alone. Of course, this comes with risk. No nation can simply replace the UN overnight. The void left behind, logistical, financial, symbolic, will be felt. In remote provinces, where UN programs once delivered food and medical aid, the weight will shift to local shoulders. Not all will bear it equally. Yet for many Burkinabé, that burden is worth carrying, because for the first time in a generation, they feel the story is theirs to tell. The moment has become a mirror for all of Africa. For too long, the continent has been forced into a binary: accept foreign aid with strings, or suffer in silence. But now, a third path is emerging, one paved by dignity. A path that says, we will accept partnership, but not paternalism. This is no longer just Burkina Faso's stand. It is a question for the entire continent. Can African nations build futures rooted in honor and agency, even if the price is higher? Can the world accept African sovereignty on Africa's terms? And now, the question is not only for Burkina Faso, but for all of Africa. Will you choose survival or sovereignty? Picture this. In New York, the blue flag of the United Nations flutters gently in the breeze, calm, steady, untouchable. Inside glass towers, officials speak in clipped tones about procedures, protocols, and precedent. But half a world away, in Ouagadougou, that same flag is being lowered quietly, deliberately, not torn, not burned, simply lowered. And in its place, young Burkinabé men and women raise banners of the AES alliance, chanting with dust-streaked faces, "Africa will decide its own future." To the global elite, this moment may seem reckless, a footnote in diplomatic history, an unnecessary escalation. But for the people of Burkina Faso, it is remembered differently. As the day their leaders said, enough. Enough of being judged by distant capitals, enough of reports that treat our pain like data, enough of watching our sons die only to be told by foreign analysts that their sacrifice means nothing. Enough of sovereignty being treated as conditional. This was not just a clash over a report, it was a battle over meaning, over who gets to define dignity. And that's why this story doesn't end here, because it was never just about Burkina Faso. It was about every African nation still waiting to be respected, not just assisted, heard, not just handled. History may look back at August 18, 2025, not as a rupture, but as an awakening. The moment when a small, battered nation said, "We may be poor, but we are not voiceless. We may need help, but we will not be humiliated." And that message has echoed. Because dignity is not given, it is declared, and in the Sahel dust, it was declared loud enough for the world to hear. If this story moves something in your chest, don't just scroll. Share, comment, and subscribe so the world must keep listening. Let the winds of African sovereignty never be silenced again. Drop one word in the comments if you believe in this fight. Dignity. Amen. Rise. Let it be known, this was never just a UN controversy. This was the resurgence of African sovereignty, bold, bruised, but unbroken.